Hello, my name is Sarah Howe. I'm a poet and a trustee of the Griffin Foundation, speaking to you from London, England today. It's my pleasure and my honour to speak across the Atlantic to my dear one-time teacher and mentor, Jorie Graham. Her many prizes and honours are too many to list now, but they include the Pulitzer Prize, a MacArthur Fellowship, and the Boylston Professorship at Harvard. Her 15th and most recent poetry collection, To 2040, has been shortlisted for the 2024 International Griffin Poetry Prize, which is why we're chatting today. So many congratulations, Jorie.
It's nice to see you.
It's lovely to see you. To 2024 feels like it picks up the baton of a much longer poetic project, one that you've been pursuing across the 4 collections that you gathered in a volume last year called To the Last Be Human, but arguably reaching back 20 years or more to a book like Never. Is it just the case that your subjects now are too big for one poetry volume to contain?
I think we all wake up every morning feeling that the world is providing urgent things that we have to attend to, which are too big for our souls to manage. I think the feeling of overwhelm is, and different kinds of overwhelm according to where you find yourself on this pretty desperate planet, whether it's the increasing desperate cries of climate scientists very recently warning us that we are at tipping point, or the massive wars, amount of people being killed at any given moment on the planet, or the natural destruction that's occurring, the disappearance of species, and then the corruption and the change in the relationships to democracy. And there's just so much that if, when you start to understand, as we all do, how interrelated it all is, it does feel like a great deal to carry. Paradoxically, in my case, the more overwhelmed I've become, the more I've slimmed down my the formal activities of my poems, that not exactly slim them down, but they've become what would the right word be? There was an abundance that I felt the liberty to work into when I was younger. When I was writing my 3rd and 4th and 5th book, I felt the future felt open, and the idea of the future felt like a luxury that I didn't even have to think about. I think that's the case for many of us who are at least my age. We knew that the future was fraught, but we didn't think it was possibly terminal. In terms of our species, we didn't think that we were completely responsible. We felt we were accountable, but going from being accountable to being responsible was a pretty massive transition. But during those years, I felt that I didn't think this. I acted out of an assumption that there was plenty of time. Now, it's also the truth that it was the case in my personal life. I was younger. I hadn't gone through 2 major illnesses. I wasn't staring mortality in the face. So, the planet, my own body, and everything in between, the idea of a democratic or a liberal society, the idea of a post-World War order where we thought certain kinds of atrocities were behind us historically, and many kinds of illusions. I wasn't in my 30s and 40s thinking about the conveyor belt, the thermaline current. I wasn't thinking about the numbers of species that are going to go extinct while we have this conversation. These were not pressing on me. So I had an amplitude, and I wrote in longer lines, and I wrote longer poems. And I, only recently began to think about what is this astringent nature, this pressure, this astringency that's sort of entered into my poetic practice. It's 2040 is different from To the Last Be Human, which accumulates the last 4 books, because it's dominated by a kind of a poetics of urgent accentual verse, in my case. A return of the idea of a very small and strict stanza, a small space to operate in, a small temporality, an urgent pressure against it, a renewed interest in the right margin, because it's a very different, when you're writing into the right margin, you're writing into what feels like an end stop or a brick wall or something that is, interrupting the flow of the line when you're moving from into the right margin, I should have said, I'm sorry. And when you're working from the left margin, which is the traditional place from which poetry works, you're operating into, again, an open space that can accommodate your voice, and you can go as far as you want. You can write a Vatic line, you can be Blake or Whitman, you can write, a pentameter line, you can write a tetrameter line, you can write any kind of line into it. It's a silence that's used to allowing entry to the human voice in all these registers. When you move into the right margin, you find yourself sort of being cut off constantly and having to sort of, as if like a boomerang, be pushed back out into the left. And you don't know what terrain you're in terms of silence, and therefore time, and therefore, your own sense of temporality itself, how much time you have, how much time there is to be said, have the thing be said in a poem. And so those two formal devices dominate to 2040 in a way that they have not done in any other book.
That's fascinating, Jorie. I'd of course noticed your return to the short line with the difference of the accentual compression here, but I hadn't really thought of it as a sort of survival mechanism in a way. You mentioned tipping point just now. I wonder, could you say a little bit more about the significance of the date in the title, which to 2040 is somewhere between a deadline or a countdown and maybe a missive addressed to that future? It's not all that far off now.
No, when I in the prior books that you mentioned that are collected in To the Last Be Human, and they are Sea Change, Fast, Place, and Runaway, in which I availed myself of longer lines, although not as massively and destructively long as perhaps in prior books, and where I negotiated with a short line every time I did engage in a longer line. So I was already operating in an intuition as I moved through those books that the amount of time left in which first of all, there's two kinds of, not to miss your question, but there's two kinds of space into which you speak. One is the time that there is to live, but there's also the attention span of others and the attention span of your society, and the ability to even be heard and not misheard, the ability to encounter the desire to listen. The idea of scarcity dominating so many of our systems now, the scarcity of attention starts out, from an unfortunate imperative. People don't have enough time to do the things that they need to do, so they can't spend much of their attention on any of the urgent things that can be spending it on, but it turns into a desire. One wants to be gratified very quickly. One wants to have an effect very quickly when one does something. One wants to feel a sensation rapidly and then be done with it. So that does lead us to privileging information over experience. You can grasp and gather information and you feel like you've captured it. And the human mind doesn't actually risk being changed by information. It can take it or leave it. And experience is a thing you have to undergo. It dilates your time. It takes its time. You have to undergo the experience on its terms, whether it's, the love of someone or being the presence of a tree. I mean, the whole range, you have to dilate and wait for the interlocutor to act, and then you respond. And then there's a way in which there's a conversation, even if it's in the silence, but it is not on your terms. It's a communal experience. That experience is the one that we're sort of doing away with our technology. So, the idea of everyone's so exercised about people being on TikTok or on incredibly short attention span devices, which encourage that. But at a certain point, that also becomes the installments by which the soul is going to allow entry to experience. And if we remember that sort of the root of passion is to suffer entrance, you know, to suffer the experience of being changed by an encounter, we are doing away with that. And we are addicted. We wouldn't be, you know, we are only addicted to a technology because they figured out what it is that we could be addicted to. They knew that speed was what would work. So, you know, speed allows you to bypass experience, and that is probably the greatest desire on the part of humans right now, which is not to be touched by experience, and just to be able to grasp, laugh, you know, be entertained quickly. So all of that, you know, is part of the problem that one has in terms of, you know, speaking out from a subject position in a poem, in prose, in the work of art of any kind, in making music, you know, in God knows how mathematicians are holding on to the attention span of their students, but probably they're letting a lot of AI do the work for them, those students. I don't know, but that is really one of the great pressing contexts in which one is writing poetry today.
You just set trees against technology beautifully in your answer there, Jorie, and I think that's an opposition that runs through this book. Another that really struck me is the presence of birds in these poems. The fact that one poem sort of replays Hans Christian Andersen's Emperor and the Nightingale with these flawless birds wired to perfection, and there's a crow that's like a manifestation of the speaker's soul, and a woodpecker that probes her heart like a Christ-like pelican, you know. So in a way, I feel like birds are the tutelary spirits of this book. And why is that?
Well, first of all, Sarah, I have been accused by reviewers for 14 books of having too many birds in my poems. My answer to that has always been, besides the obvious sense that they're messengers and that they move between one realm and another easily, and that they move between the earth and the sky in particular, that they seem to vanish but don't, that they can, once having vanished, still be present through their call. They in many ways resemble the Orphic ambitions of lyric poetry itself, and they have been therefore the tutelary messengers in poems throughout all of the history of poetry. So they're not particularly, you know, surprising to find birds in lyric poems. And the poems about birds that have been my guides throughout my writing life are all the obvious ones. What would we do without, you know, the Keats's Nightingale, or Hardy's Thrush, or, you know, Hopkins' Windhover? I mean, there's no way to the albatross. I mean, there's no way to not imagine the bird as that emissary. At the same time, I'm writing at a time when I look out at my garden and I think, I'm not upset here now, but there's so many fewer birds now. They're just not coming back. And so I think they must be elsewhere, right? The birds must have gone elsewhere. And then I look, you know, it up, and I talk to the different people who know such things on the place I live, and they say, oh no, those are extinct. Those are not coming back. We're losing an amount of bird species every day on this planet that is unfathomable. Between the insects and the birds, it's hard to imagine what the planet will sound like. And I have, in 2040, taken that title and spoken to the future people who live in that year, which when I was writing the book seemed more far off than it does now. And trying to get them to imagine what it was like to live now, and trying to get people who live now to imagine what it will be like to be in the position of the people 7 generations down the line who look back and say, but why didn't you stop? Why didn't you avert? Why didn't you change? How could you have done this? So it's that conversation that one has. I've mentioned this many times before, but by now it's the name of a commercial product in the United States, but the Iroquois used to have a practice referred to as the 7th generation, in which the elder would walk with an imaginary child from 7 generations hence along the river and ask the imaginary 7th generation, how many fish should we take from the river so that there will be plenty for you? And that notion of trying to get, invoke for us now, the fact that we are connected by a very distinct thread of continuity to people that are not our children and not our grandchildren, but are 7 generations at least ahead of us, but who will be completely destroyed, or at least, stuck with the outcome of whatever choices we make now. And that we have, by every notion of what an umbilical is, we are connected to those people. We just don't think we are. And we keep them out of mind, and we don't imagine them as living beings, something which, indigenous people and our ancestors used to do routinely. You couldn't live on farmland and learn how to, think about the future and the life of your crops if you didn't think about what the land was going to be like 2 or 3 seasons forward. So, awakening our relationship to those future people is a great deal of the project of that book.
Thank you, Jorie, for these beautiful and profound answers, as I've come to always expect from you. Would you be happy to read us a bit of a poem now?
Yeah, I thought I'd read. It's a longer poem, and there's not time for it, but it's called Dawn 2040. It's from, there's both an English edition from Carcanet and a beautiful American edition from Copper Canyon, which I will hold up because I'm supposed to. I don't have the gorgeous one from Carcanet, but it's really beautiful, very dramatic red on the cover. In this poem, I awake, and it starts, these tiny sounds you think you hear in the house elsewhere. Is someone awake? Is someone alive? You turn around. Just now, you hear yourself say, I know what finished is. I know the just now, and then the just gone. I am alive. And the sun arrives, and there's a relationship with the sun, and it gets way too hot. And the person is advised by the sun. It's in the tradition of those many poems, whether it's O'Hara or Mayakovsky, or the poems in which the speaker has a conversation with the sun, and the sun says, you better hide from me. The sun begins to rise and says, you don't have much time, and you can't inhale me, and I will burn your lungs, and find shelter. And the poem ends this way. I think it connects with what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. The cicadas, it talks about the sun moving across the fields. The cicadas will soon begin in unison, the song of unison, till you can hear no more variation, no rise or fall. Can I live, please, in this unchanging sound, I ask, as we enter further into your day rise? What was that just flew over? What else is in here? I sit as quietly as breathing permits. All's hum and insect thread. Nothing unlocks. Yes, there's burning wind sometimes, but all is building towards sand's hard thought. Nothing will change its mind, this dune of the future, as it moves towards us. Here, where we can, for now, still hide. You there, wondering what to do with your day. Yawning as you wake from dream. I can almost make you out in your brightening morning light. You there, wake up. But nobody's here. Just the earth revolving, inexhaustible, without purpose, in which from moment to moment, even now, change gathers, inception gathers, and variation, and proliferation, and all is. All is. Do you remember?
That was stunning, Jorie. Thank you so much. What a powerful, powerful reading to end on. Thank you so much for talking to us today. That was absolutely fascinating. And to our viewers at home, the Griffin Prize readings will happen this year on June 5th at the Kerner Hall in Toronto. Maybe we'll see you there. And thank you everyone for listening.